Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live webcast about new regulations affecting our local ports. We're broadcasting today live from the Ocean Science Center at the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California. Next to me, you see our science on a sphere. And those lines on the sphere are ship tracks over a 12-month period from the 1st of October of 2004 until the 1st of October of 2005. So over 1 year, but they only represent 11% of all the ships that were operating in the ocean at that time. It's useful to remind ourselves that international trade, more than 95% of the cargo moves by ship. That's 98, it's actually more than 98% in terms of weight and volume. So ships and our ports are extraordinarily important to the national and the international economy. Today we're going to hear about new regulations, and we're going to hear about these regulations from representatives of the Port of Long Beach and the Port of Los Angeles. As you watch our presentation, we welcome you to send us your questions via Twitter, and you can do that at Aquarium Pacific using the hashtag AOP Ports. Or you can send an email to live@lbaop.org. And later in the program, we'll try to answer your questions. All of us rely on the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. Many of the goods that we purchase, from electronics to clothing and furniture, among other things, come through these two ports. And they come through in large quantities. If combined, these two ports would constitute the 9th largest port complex in the world in terms of container volume. Here in Southern California, the public cares about environmental impact, particularly as it relates to human health. Both ports have made significant strides in reducing their impacts by the greening of their operations and setting rules for trucks, trains, and ships within the ports, and that within is important. New national and international regulations that you're going to hear about today took effect on January 1 of this year, and they apply to ships that enter these ports, and they cover an area out from the shore 20 miles out. They're aimed at reducing carbon emissions and other emissions that contribute to poor air quality and to climate change. And to tell us about these regulations, I want first to introduce Rick Cameron, who's the Managing Director of Environmental Planning at the Port of Long Beach. Rick?
Thank you, Jerry. It's a pleasure to be here and be invited to participate in this webcast. The Port of Long Beach has been an environmental steward for many decades. Approximately 10 years ago, however, our Board of Harbor Commissioners, working with a variety of stakeholders, adopted the Green Port Policy. And actually, we are on our 10-year anniversary of our Green Port Policy. We have done an amazing job in terms of really refocusing and changing our culture at the port, being a better neighbor with our city, with a variety of stakeholders, not only within the region, but within the state, within the nation, and internationally as well, when we talk about our partners and moving forward with environmental stewardship and a variety of strategies that the two ports have developed here over the course of the last 10 years. One of the fundamental and really award-winning programs was our Clean Air Action Plan that the two ports collaborated with, both with our South Coast Air Quality Management District, the California Air Resources Board, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, back in 2006. We then moved forward with a variety of programs in terms of developing strategies, and one of those was the award-winning Clean Trucks program, and something that both ports are very proud of in terms of the success. We see a 90% reduction in overall emissions by implementing the Clean Trucks program. And that was successful in terms of working with a variety of our stakeholders in terms of the trucking companies and a lot of our operations. We've also looked at vessels in terms of vessel operations, both within port as well as when vessels are transiting, whether they're leaving or coming to San Pedro Bay. And when when the international standard, the IMO Annex 6, looked at regulating fuels on vessels as well as future engine standards, the two ports were very supportive. We worked side by side with the US EPA and the US Coast Guard in supporting this international standard, which sets a fair playing field when it comes to the environmental control area of waters of the US. And actually it starts at 200 miles. We do have individual programs at the two ports addressing vessel slowdown. Our Green Flag program is one of those, where we incentivize vessels to slow down to 12 knots, as they're approaching San Pedro Bay. And we're also looking at incentivizing our shipping operations to bring in the cleanest vessels. So looking at everything, what we can do within our fence line, what we have control over, what we believe is right for our operations, for the health of our communities, and to be good environmental stewards. This is what the two ports have done. I'm very proud of what we've accomplished. I think in the future, we're going to see the next evolution, and I really see energy being part of that focal point where we sort of talk about efficiency of our terminal operations in conjunction with cleaner operations in terms of these newer technologies that we'll be demonstrating and hopefully in the future deploying as part of our overall operations, collaborating with all of our stakeholders. So with that being said, I'd like to go ahead and turn this back over to Jerry and give time to my counterpart, Chris Cannon.
Thank you, Rick. And now I want to introduce Chris Cannon. He's the Director of Environmental Management for the Port of Los Angeles.
Thank you, Jerry. And I wanted to say one thing. You mentioned that the two ports have an awful lot of goods that come through the two ports in the United States. Actually, it's 43% of all imported goods in the United States come through these two ports. So it's a major gateway. And as Rick has said, it's something that we take very, very important, our responsibility not only to operate the ports, but to do it in a way that's clean. The new regulations that we're talking about, the IMO emission control area, results in a 90% reduction in emissions from previous ECA, we call it, emission control area requirements. One thing we are happy to say that here in California, our Air Resources Board has already had fuel standards that are comparable or the same as the IMO, but they only go out to 24 miles. And so this new change here, starting on January 1, goes all the way out to 200 miles, and it helps to reduce harmful SOx, sulfur oxide emissions. Sulfur emissions are toxic. They contribute to asthma, and they are also a precursor to ozone. I also, Rick mentioned, and I want to point out that this is now coming up on a 10-year anniversary for our Clean Air Action Plan. That was something that was groundbreaking. The two ports working together did, and we're proud of all the success that we've had, as Rick pointed out, between 80 and 90% emission reductions from port-related sources. We're happy to say at the Port of Los Angeles we pioneered the shore power process, where ships reach berth and then plug into shore power. They turn off their auxiliary engines and operate on electricity. We pioneered that back in 2004 with the China shipping facility, and we're happy to say that this now, last year, became a state regulation that was adopted by the Air Resources Board, and that's something that we're very, very proud of. And then also the vessel speed reduction program, it's important relative to what's happening here with the aquarium, because in addition to reducing emissions and reducing the carbon footprint, it also reduces the chance of whale strikes. And as you know, there are whale migration and feeding pathways that cross the shipping lanes, and when the ships slow down from 20 knots, which is their normal speed out at sea, to 12 knots, it gives the whales a chance to get out of the way, and we've seen less whale strikes, and of course that's something that's very important. And also one thing that I want to mention that gets overlooked because of all of the benefits and the good experience that we've had with air quality reduction, and that's water quality. And I think that's relevant here for the aquarium. We have something called a Water Resources Action Plan as well. And as a result of our Water Resources Action Plan, we have a very rich and diverse marine habitat. We see lots of animals, lots of marine life. We see dolphins, which everybody enjoys seeing, but also the kelp beds here in the port have expanded. Eelgrass, which is an important element here, has grown. We also are happy to say that there's a colony of California sea lions that are out on the rocks near Pier 400. And all these things are things that we're proud of. You'd think that with 43% of imported goods in the United States in an area like these two ports, that the water would be dirty. And in fact, it's clean. We do not exceed standards for water quality in the two ports, and we're happy to say that this is an important element and success in our past. As Rick pointed out, our future is going to be based on us focusing on reduced reliance on combustion-based engine sources, and that means a movement towards zero emissions and hybrid technologies. We're proud to say that we're the first, working with Long Beach, to have a hybrid tugboat, and that hybrid tugboat, now we have two of them, and they're operating here in the ports, and that's something that we're very proud of as well. So I want to thank you for inviting us to come. We're happy to be here and be happy to take any of your questions.
Thank you, Chris. For those of you who don't know what IMO is, it's the International Maritime Organization, and these new regulations then take these restrictions from 24 miles out to 200 nautical miles, which is the outer edge of the exclusive economic zone. And this applies not only to the West Coast and not only even to the United States. It's clear, I think, that the Port of Long Beach and Los Angeles both play critically important roles in our country's international trade. You've heard that. 43% of all imports come through these two ports. It's also clear, I think, that they have given a priority to setting policies that make them good environmental stewards and sticking with those policies to reduce environmental impact. That makes them leaders in the green business world. And there are two issues, I think, that illustrate that commitment that I would like to comment on briefly. You've already heard that one of the major impacts of the port operations in this region is on air quality, and that has public health implications. They've worked hard over the last 2 decades to reduce those impacts. Chris and Rick have told us that these actions have been undertaken largely through the Clean Air Action Plan, and they have resulted in large decreases in diesel emissions from terminal operations, from trucks and all of the other kinds of equipment that are on site. And that's real progress. And we heard them talk about dealing with trains and ships, particularly trains and ships that enter into the port and leave the port. And those are much more difficult to regulate, but they are having major impacts. Many of these are through non-regulatory efforts, and it's because they've set such a good example of being environmental stewards. Another area that you heard mentioned was wildlife, and we take particular interest in wildlife here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. The coastal waters throughout Southern California are rich in the amount and the diversity of marine life, and it's easy for many people to wonder how 2 of the biggest ports in the world can coexist with marine life. And yet, all of the surveys that are conducted every few years have shown a steady increase in the quality of marine habitats. And right now, under these massive ships and next to the large container terminals, biologists find giant kelp, eelgrass, nesting endangered species, and where once there was a paucity of marine life, and not very long ago, now we see more than 60 species of fish, hundreds of species of invertebrates, and nearly 100 species of birds. The harbors are teeming with marine life, and we can thank the Clean Water Act and the port's commitment to implementing that for this improvement. The harbors also provide a valuable nursery for many fish and even for some birds. This is a great success story, and it's one that our 2 ports played a lead role in. I think that it's really important for us to recognize that this is an example of humans and nature coexisting in harmony. And with 7.3 billion people on the planet going to 10 billion, we've got to figure out how we can coexist with nature. Southern California is a perfect place to do that because we've got more than 20 million people living between Santa Barbara and the US-Mexico border. That's more than any entire state in the nation except Texas. And this is a good example of what we can do. And no sooner had the ports begun to deal with air quality and wildlife issues, but the next big issue popped up, and that's climate change. What can the ports do? Well, I think this is an interesting issue, and some of you who may have watched the State of the Union speech last night by our president, he talked about the need to address climate change. And the ports have to deal with sea level rise, which is one aspect of climate change. That's adaptation. The question is, what can they do to mitigate? That is, to reduce climate change. And they're doing that by reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And they're doing that by switching from dirty fuels to cleaner fuels, including natural gas, solar, and electric power in their terminals, their trucks, their trains, and the ships that serve the terminals. As they implement shoreside electric power for ships and electric and natural gas powered trucks and terminal equipment, they are leading the way in the entire shipping industry. So I think it's clear to me that the ports have been very good neighbors. And through their efforts, they have become a positive factor in our environmental protection efforts here in Southern California. Now we're going to see if we have any questions that have been submitted by our viewers. Allie, what has come in?
How are these new regulations enforced?
How are these new regulations enforced? So I'm going to ask either of you or both of you to come up and tell us how these are going to be enforced.
They actually, the sulfur NOx or sulfur regulations are enforced through an audit. We actually just read in the newspaper that one of the ships was actually issued a citation because they had they were not using proper fuels. So they have teams that go out. The state does, and they go out and check the fuel records and check the emissions. And to make sure that these ships are meeting the standards. So you can look in the newspapers recently, one just got fined, and so that's how it's done.
Allie, another one?
Is there any anticipated impact on operations or business?
Is there any impact that's expected in terms of these regulations on the port's business?
I don't think so. I think these regulations have been out in terms of the anticipation of them coming into place by a lot of our customers, whether it's the regulations or the programs that the ports have developed over time. We've allowed for there to be a transition for a variety of our industry partners. When it comes to the environmental control area, a lot of the shipping companies had known well in advance, and I think they started to prepare for that. Just like the shore power rules that the state of California had developed and we're fully implementing starting January 1st, 2014. So I don't believe there's major impacts. I think we provide collaborative ways of ensuring that there's a good transition so we don't disrupt our businesses. And I think that's just true sustainability. So.
We'll take one more. Allie?
Can you explain the concern about ballast water and how the regulations are addressing that?
Can you explain the concerns about ballast water, invasive species, and how the regulations are affecting that?
That's a very good question, actually. The concern about ballast water has been going on for a while. What happens is the habitat over in other locations of the world where the ships come is different than the habitat here in the port. And so the natural organisms that maybe check and balance the growth of certain species in those places don't exist here. So you bring these new invasive species and they flourish because the natural things that would control their growth don't occur here. And it's a very big issue. It's something that the State Lands Commission here in the state of California has actually pioneered in terms of trying to reduce those emissions. There are new requirements now that you can't exchange ballast water when you get into the port. It has to be done out in mid-sea. There are also some developing requirements that test the actual ballast water itself to make sure that there's not any organisms in it. And a lot of discussion about possibly even testing ballast water or having ballast water exchange systems at the wharfs themselves. Now that's a challenge because wharf space is at a premium. So in addition to that, there are new on-ship cleansing or cleaning systems for ballast water that are also being tested. So a very important issue. Something that we've been lucky that here in the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, we haven't had too big of a problem. They've had worse a problem up in the Bay Area, but a very good question.
Thank you. And when you look at this figure on the sphere behind me, you can see that this many ships, and if they're sailing light, in order to have ship stability, they have to take on ballast water, and the hitchhikers that are in that are moving around the world. Some of these ships, the amount of water that they have when they sail light, that they have in ballast, would make them the largest aquariums in the world. Now, one of the reasons I think that we have had less of a problem here than in many other areas, particularly in San Francisco is a different story, but on the East Coast, most of the ships who come here are fully loaded, so they don't have a whole lot of ballast water. When they leave, many of them are sailing light, so they take on ballast water. So my hunch is we export more animals to other places than we import. Do you either want to comment? All right. Well, I would like to thank our two guests for very interesting comments about this very important issue. And that concludes our live webcast. We thank all of you for joining us. The next thing we're going to do is to show the aquarium show on the Science on a Sphere about our two local ports. It's called a working waterfront, the seaports of San Pedro Bay, and it lasts about 5 minutes. And then after that, all of you from the media can corner our guests and ask them questions. Thank you all for joining us, and Rick and Chris, thank you very much.